So what I'm going to be demonstrating today is some different techniques we can use in SQL to better run reporting. I see a lot of instances where reporting is being done in Magento and it's being done strictly in PHP. And sometimes people do this in a dev environment, you have limited data, then you try and run this in production and it all falls apart. There's other issues just with doing that because when you're doing in PHP inside Magento, you're running these large data models that have a lot of memory overhead, and you're trying to do all these joins and loops in PHP, and PHP is just not good at doing that. So the two things I really wanted to demonstrate today were going to be crosstab queries and materialized views. And has anybody had a chance to memorize the data model here? Can you see that? So to start off with this, we're going to be doing crosstab queries. And to do this, we're going to use the Magento 1 database because I'm going to be demonstrating this in the customer EAV model. This has been changed in Magento 2. The EAV model still exists for customers, but they moved a lot of the values that were in attributes into the main customer entity table. So the model's still there, and this still would have the same value in M2, but there's just less data to work with, and the M1 database has just a little bit better demonstration of this than M2. So the first thing we're going to be doing is just getting our customer entity table, and what we're going to do with the attributes is flatten that data out, the crosstab query, into columns. If you're familiar with Excel at all, this would be more like a pivot table in Excel. We're just doing it in SQL, and then we can potentially join that with other tables, merge it with sales data, anything like that to get just more value out of the database and be able to reuse that later in other queries. So being this is going to be live coding, anything can happen. A laptop may crash, it may explode and kill me. So hopefully you'll see some crosstab queries and materialized views. You'll definitely see me fat fingering some SQL though. So starting off, we're going to get, I'm already doing it. Our customer entity table, because that's our parent. So this is just all sample data in here. And really the only customer identifiable thing in this table is email. First name, last name, everything else is going to be in attribute tables. So to find out exactly what's in there, we have to join in the metadata tables that define what those attributes are. There's two of those. Customer EAV attribute. And that one, we actually don't need to, we can just do a straight join on that. We're going to abbreviate this to CAV. And we need the basically definer of all of the EAV attributes is just called EAV attribute. Oh my God. Attribute. And we'll just name that one EAV. So when we run that now, if it wants to run, helps if I put in the on clause. Now that should work. Or not. So this is going to basically tell us all of our attribute codes, and specifically you also want to know the backend type, because that's going to tell us what table we need to look in for the data. The other thing in here is that some of the backend types are static. Static indicates that value is actually in the customer entity table. So we're going to just exclude those because we already have them. So now we have that data. And if we look at these attribute codes, some of these are related to addresses, which those are merged into the customer model as well. We're going to exclude those later because we're just, for right now, going to get purely data that's related to customer entity. Now we actually have to go in and get the attribute data. To do that, we're going to need to use left joins because each one of these rows is not always going to exist for each attribute type in these tables. The EV model is built so that it'll preserve data types for each one of these attributes. So there's going to be 5 different ones that we need to go after for this. So this will take a little bit of time to type out here. The first one is customer entity date type, date time, I should say. And we'll need to join that back to the customer entity table. And we also need to join that for the attribute types as well. So that's our first one. We'll just need to copy this out. The other 5, or the other 4, I should say. So decimal, int, text, and varchar. So now if we run this, we get all the data in here, and it is very far from being flattened at this point, but at least the data is in one place. So we're going to filter this down a little bit. We don't need every single one of these columns for this first step. We'll get everything out of the customer entity table for now. We're going to need to know the metadata for the backend type and for the attribute code. So EAV attribute code and EAV backend type. And we'll also need each one of the values that are potentially in these attribute tables. So for each one of these, we'll need to grab value, and we'll want to alias all of these. And now we have our attribute values in these columns. So we still need to filter out some of this address stuff. We don't want to be bringing in rows that we don't need. So we'll get each one of these, and we'll just say that one of these columns has to be not null. So we'll add in our where clause to do that. And that's filtered down our data. We're now going to be using this data as part of a subquery. Since we're going to make this into a view, MySQL does not allow you to use subqueries in a view. However, you can use a view within another view, so it accomplishes the same thing. So we're going to create this as a view and name it VW customer EAV. Run that, and that creates our view. We should see it as our only view there. So now that we have this data into a grid, now we can actually go to the flattening part of this and build the Crosstab query. So selecting customer EAV, we have our grid, we have our columns defined with what data type. These data types will be preserved because they are back in the attribute tables preserved there as well. So what we're going to be looking at here is using a group by clause, and we need to group this down so we have one row per each user, and then we'll break these all out into separate attribute types. So first, we're just going to filter this down and get entity ID. Actually, first thing I want to do is I want to get the distinct attribute codes and the backend types for these. It'll just help me define my columns easier. So we'll just say distinct attribute code and backend type. And now we're down to a fairly limited data set. We'll just be working with these 7 attributes. And for now, just do entity ID as one column. and paste this in here because we're going to be defining each column and finding what the correct value is for each of these attribute codes in that grid. And since I'm running a little short on time here, I'm going to get rid of these. So now if we run this, we still get some ugly looking data. So now we have to actually find what value in each of these columns we need to grab. To do that, we're going to use an if statement because we know what our attribute code is for each of these. We can say if attribute code is equal to this value, then return the column value. If not, just have it be null. So, I got to put in the correct attribute codes for each one. And now our values are actually filtered down, so we have one column per attribute code. Now we can add in a group by to say the first column, because that's going to be our primary key. And this will still be only returning one value because we haven't actually found the correct value for each of these columns yet. But since every other value for them is going to be null at this point because of our if statement, we can just say, do a max on each one of these. Nulls always come first. So if we do max, it will get the only value that should exist. And now we have our flattened data for those attributes. And we can bring in some of the other columns that we might want: email, created at, updated at. There's store value data in there that might be useful, but that's good for now. So there's our flattened data. Also looking like I'm running out of time here, so I'm not going to be able to get to the materialized views. But for what those are, it's basically taking a view like this and putting that into a flattened table. So if we're using these in reporting, this query runs pretty fast. However, you could have a huge data set, and especially if you're going to be merging that in with sales data, anything like that, you want to flatten out that view. I do have the materialized views code that I wrote up on our GitHub repo. Our GitHub repo is just MageMojo. If you wanted to check that out, I'll build that out a little bit later, add some more instructions to it. I thought I was going to have time to get to it, but unfortunately not. Do we still have some time for some questions if anybody has any?
Absolutely do. And I have a microphone now. So do you have any questions for Martin? I can bring it around for you.
Right.
Don't be shy. He doesn't bite. He does kick, but he doesn't bite.
There's no kicking in it.
Oh, come on. All right, we got one.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
One question real
Oh,
quick.
there is a question?
Did you say there are examples online somewhere?
Yeah, on our GitHub repo, it's just MageMojo. If you want to look up there, I have the materialized views up there. I will get the customer EAV stuff up there as well, and I'll name them so they're easily findable.
Anyone else? I would throw it at you.
Hi. So you use MySQL, right?
Yeah, this is MySQL.
And MySQL or MySQL?
This is MySQL.
Oh, okay. Then I don't have a question. I thought that you're using MySQL. I was wondering how you
This program's Toad
move the
Edge.
data.
It's not commonly used, but my background is partially an Oracle developer, and this is a tool for Oracle application developers. They have a MySQL version of it, though.
Okay, thank you.
One more question. All right, we got.
Can we use those queries with RG metrics too, or only with an system?
I'm sorry, with what methods?
RG metrics, the metric system that Magento is pushing now.
I mean, you can use this type of crosstab query pretty much with any kind of data. It's basically the method that you would use to turn a row into a column. So it works well with EAV model, but any other model that you have, like kind of any attribute type thing, you can use these types of queries for.
Okay, thank you.